Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 191 of Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the last week of October 2025. In today's podcast, Battle for Pokrovsk, we're going to talk about the situation in the most desired city for the Russian occupiers, which will open bigger opportunities for them to invade other cities. So Kiev's growing manpower shortage is becoming increasingly apparent. After 3.5 years of heroic and exceptionally bloody resistance, there are fears that Ukraine might be approaching a point where the country simply will not have enough soldiers left to effectively hold the front line in the largest war on the European continent since World War II. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said this week that the Ukrainian forces are now outnumbered by the enemy in the Pokrovsk direction in the ratio of 8 to 1, a clear indication of the scale of the problem. Ukraine's mobilization challenges have long been well known and have only grown for much of the war. In the early days of the full scale invasion, in early 2022, an unprecedented influx of volunteers helped to dramatically increase the size of Ukraine's armed forces to around a million men. But as the war dragged on for 4 years with heavy casualties and an increasing desertion, the initial stream of volunteers dwindled to a relatively small trickle. Some units began running their own flamboyant advertising campaigns to attract new recruits, while military enlistment offices became notorious for literally catching men of military age off the streets and sending them straight to the military bases. Among other issues, the mobilization problem is compounded by President Zelensky's reluctance to lower the age limit for compulsory military service from 25 to 18 years old. This has drawn criticism from Ukraine's Western partners, who argue that it's unrealistic to wage a large scale war while exempting such a large number of young Ukrainians from mobilization. Rather than make the politically risky decision to lower the conscription age, Zelensky has backed a system of incentives aimed at attracting volunteers between the ages of 18 and 25. However, this initiative has so far failed to make up for the losses in the severely depleted Ukraine's army frontline units. The recent decision to lift travel restrictions for young Ukrainians between the ages of 18 and 22 has further complicated Ukraine's personnel problem. According to the British Daily Telegraph, since the relaxation was introduced about 2 months ago, about 100,000 men have left the country. This exodus deprives the state of potential future recruits and is already creating a whole range of more pressing personnel problems, the reverberations of which are left throughout the Ukrainian economy. While some of these men may tend to return to their homeland, experience since 2022 suggests that many of them will seek employment elsewhere in the European Union. Moscow is also struggling to replenish its invasion army amid catastrophic losses in Ukraine, which far exceed the death toll in all of the Kremlin's other wars since 2045. Since 1945, Putin initially attempted to address this problem by announcing partial mobilization in September 2022, but the move proved widely unpopular and led to an estimated 1 million young Russians fleeing the country. Instead, the Kremlin has introduced a system of generous financial incentives, including huge bonuses for enlisting and high monthly salaries to attract volunteers willing to fight in the Ukrainian war. Although The amounts of the reward have had to be increased several times. This approach has ensured an influx of approximately 30,000 new recruits each month. Judging by the current dynamics of the war, Russia's numerical advantage over Ukraine will only increase over time. This is already being felt along the nearly 1,000-kilometer front line, where Russian troops are exploiting gaps in Ukrainian defenses and are gradually advancing in several areas. While Putin's forces have yet to make major breakthroughs, Russia's territorial gains are slowly but steadily increasing. The fiercest fighting is currently taking place in the Donetsk region, where Russia is seeking to complete the capture of Pokrovsk city. If Putin commanders succeed in taking the city, many will see it as confirmation of Kremlin's strategy of winning through exhaustion, relying on the numerical superiority of the Russian army over Ukrainian. Putin has long believed that he can win the war simply by waiting for the West to run out of patience and then overwhelming Ukraine with his own troops. The increasingly chronic shortage of soldiers in Kiev will be the most compelling evidence, yet the time is on his side. For President Zelensky, there are no easy solutions. Lowering the conscription age could bring in a flood of new recruits, but it could also deal a serious blow to the nation's morale. Reforming the conditions of military service with a more robust ration, rotation system and more methodic approach to appointing commanders could help restore waning public trust and attract more volunteers, but that would take time, which frankly Ukraine has little time for. Now, the battle hardened but outnumbered Ukraine army will have no choice but to maintain a defensive posture. Ukraine's command must be prepared to cede territory when necessary to maintain combat capability while seeking to inflict as many casualties as possible on the enemy. The main goal is to withstand Russian pressure until a combination of heavy losses on the front, increasing attacks on the rear, and deepening economic difficulties deepening economic difficulties force Putin to sit down at the negotiation table. Why is this situation in Pokrovsk so complicated? So the answer is simple. In Pokrovsk, the enemies are using updated urban combat tactics. They are learning, improving, and not standing still. Pokrovsk and Kupiansk are what we can see in the near future in Siversk, Konstantinovka, and Liman. The use of excessive infantry components in the Russian occupation forces is due to the depletion of the mechanized component, but no matter how much we scold the Russians, they were able to tactically adapt to the fact that instead of dozens of tanks per hour in a row, they will have to attack with dozens of infantrymen per hour, and they adapted the field tactics of combat operations. So we understand for both sides in Pokrovsk, the time has come for a decisive battle. From both sides, reserves have already been thrown into the fray, and intense clashes are sweeping the sector. The stakes are equally high for both Kiev and Moscow. Contrary to my usual approach, when I consider the capture of territory to be secondary to the task of inflicting maximum losses on the enemy at minimal cost to myself, this time a large scale battle is needed despite all the risks. Pokrovsk is now of both operational and strategic importance, and if I'm right, the defense is going, for the most part, according to the plan. This sounds strange considering that the media is trumpeting the inevitable fall of the city as the Russians break through the holes in the Ukrainian positions. The Russians are already, so to speak, deep inside the Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians might be defeated in the battle, but they may win it. And in doing so, they will deal a decisive blow to Putin's last hope of capturing the Donbass urban agglomeration. He is betting heavily on Pokrovsk, so a defeat for his force here would be a colossal blow. The Russians have been marching from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk for almost 2 years, covering a distance of almost only 50 kilometers. It's basically only 30 miles, less than an hour drive in a peacetime. The human and material losses suffered by Moscow are comparable to the bloodiest battle of both world wars. Hundreds of thousands killed and wounded. In an objective, scientific sense, it is catastrophe, the military failure that often precedes the fall of a regime, especially one like Moscow's. However, if Putin forces do eventually gain foothold in Pokrovsk, the city will become a robust base for further advances, virtually guaranteeing fierce fighting for the great urban strongholds of the Donbass region. In this case, Putin will be able to claim, at least partially convincingly, that his army is achieving real results, even if at the cost of catastrophic losses. As you understand, Putin doesn't reveal the catastrophic losses and the number of people, Russian people died. If my assessment of the Ukrainian operational strategy is correct, then the way the defense of Pokrovsk was organized indicates that the enemy breakthrough was expected sooner or later. Once they did, the plan was to drive them into ruins and destroy them in a targeted and methodical manner, which would open the way for a large scale counteroffensive aimed at stabilizing the area and nullifying Putin's gains. Despite the extremely difficult situation, the Battle of Pokrovsk is far from lost. The tempting prospect of a large scale battlefield victory led Putin to order the city to be taken at all costs. This deprives Russia of the initiative and transfer it to Ukraine, provided that there are enough forces to enter the game, and make Putin's pay for his mistake. This is, in fact, the essence of General Sirski's entire plan, if it even remotely coincides with what I expect. According to the latest data, Ukrainian special forces are heading into the city to eliminate about 200 enemy who have infiltrated here. No doubt, larger groups are moving behind them, so the battle will be bloody. Some of the best Ukrainian brigades are now working for the 1st and 7th Corps, to which, as far as I can say, the 9th Corps has completely handed over the front. According to several reports, Moscow has over 10,000 fresh fighters ready to go in human waves as part of the Second United Army. At the same time, the first disposable forces are trying to penetrate as deeply as possible through the Ukrainian positions to attack logistics and drone units. Most of them should be killed or wounded by the end of December. How many Ukrainian lives it will cost will determine how far Ukraine will be able to push the enemy back in the winter and spring. The Russian tactics were strikingly reminiscent for the methods used by the Japanese army during the Pacific War. The Japanese would throw large numbers of infantry close to the enemy's positions, trying to penetrate their defenses. When coordinated attacks began, the resulting chaos opened the way for massive assaults that could simply crush the defenses. It was with these techniques that the Japanese stunned British forces in Southeast Asia and eventually captured the seemingly impregnable fortress of Singapore, a major blow to London, comparable to the fall of France and a symbol of the end of the British Empire. So, When when all went according to the plan, the Japanese infiltration tactics, penetration, and surprise assault could lead to a swift and decisive defeat of the enemy. However, again, countries like USSR and the United States, which relied primarily on firepower, the strategy of infiltrate and then attack, inevitably ended in catastrophic losses and defeat on the battlefield. This is the eternal problem for such operations, whether landings by parachutes, glider, boat, helicopter, or any other means of bypassing the enemy's forward positions. The effect of surprise lasts very short, and unless the enemy's main line is broken by powerful reinforcements, the saboteurs are doomed. At the strategic level, what is happening to the Russians in Ukraine is so obvious that the fact that most American experts do not notice it speaks for itself about the deep degradation of military science in the unfortunate country. To recreate the conditions that allowed for rapid advances in 2022, Moscow had to be forced back into the campaign that exceeded its actual capabilities. Ukrainian General Syrskyi, perhaps thanks to the Soviet school, has been maneuvering purposefully since 2024, drawing the Russians into exactly this kind of trap that the troops under his command set for the enemy near Kharkiv in 2022 and liberated the region. Whether this grand plan will be viable in the current realities will have to be determined in Pokrovsk by the end of this year. What happens there will be a key signal. Whether Moscow can take its other priority targets, Liman and to less extent Kupiansk, if they do not fall by the early 2026, they will never fall. And therefore, Moscow will never capture all of the Donbass. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share it with your friends.